left off, we were talking about AIDS, and is it targeted toward the black community? Actually, we were talking about crack and whether it was targeted toward the black community, and that moves into AIDS as well. There are rumors, there are people who think there's a big conspiracy, that AIDS was planted into the black community to get rid of the black population. You, in your book, Pat, do you say what?
There's a whole range of beliefs. There's that belief that it was planted on purpose. There's also the belief that it wasn't really planted on purpose. They were experimenting in biological warfare. They needed a disposable population, so that Haitians and Africans fit that bill. There's the belief that there are doctors who inject AIDS into their patients. There's a whole range of beliefs that African Americans subscribe to, and they use to authenticate it very real things that can be proven. For example, the Tuskegee experiment, where for 40 years African American men went untreated with syphilis after the invention of penicillin, when their suffering could have been eased.
Now that is fact.
That is fact. There's a wonderful book on it. I'll plug somebody else's book, Bad Blood, that details the experiment from the 1930s through the 1970s. One of the scariest things about that whole incident, lots of people think that this was a big government secret and conspiracy. It wasn't. It was being reported in the medical journals. Doctors and scientists were elaborating on it in their conventions. They didn't think that letting African American men go untreated with syphilis was sufficiently criminal to cover it up.
Rolonda, one point I want to make about just this overall area of conspiracies is that conspiracies don't just apply to a particular event. They also have to do with how we're organized to see and think about the world. So in fact, a lot when we talk about the AIDS conspiracy in the black community or crack cocaine, we get into debates about whether or not it is or isn't. But in fact, if there is a dialogue about the possibility of there being a conspiracy, I think we have to look at the impact of that, how vulnerable that makes the black community, whether it is a conspiracy or is not. And I think that at the risk of sounding like a conspiracy theorist, I think there's a conspiracy about tying Americans to thinking and seeing the world from the perspective of conspiracies, because it keeps this kind of dialogue going and keeps us.
There is one question.
How about this? Nick, Curtis, and then Michael, okay?
There is one question you have to ask yourself. Only up until about 30 years ago, there was AIDS. Before 30 years ago, nobody heard about AIDS. And if you look into the documentation about the researchers who have been looking into AIDS, they're all people working with germ warfare. All the people basically working on the AIDS research have a deep linkage to United States germ warfare. They were afraid of the Russians, they were afraid of the communists, and they were thinking that maybe besides the bomb, they could use germ warfare. And all of a sudden, we have this AIDS situation that was kind of coincidentally released in Africa. You know, it's kind of a coincidence.
Right. And that's actually what the conspiracy that has been spoken about was the possibility of it being introduced. Okay, I'm agreeing with you, brother. Right.
Very quickly, and I'm going to go to Curtis and Michael.
Being introduced into Africa as germ warfare. Did that happen? I don't know. Is it possible scientifically? Yes. Is it the case that when there was serious research beginning, it was when it came to the United States? So obviously there are populations and people in the world that if people think you're threatened, and if they're white, it tends to be dealt with. If it's African, it's not. And I don't even know if you have to call that a conspiracy. I think it's a fact that we have to take a good look at.
What do you say, Michael?
I think we're missing a whole point that has to be brought up and has nothing to do with conspiracies, but rather the culture of victimization. And it puts down African Americans, it puts down Jews, it puts down gays, it puts down Americans, puts down women to believe that everything that's out there is being planted in our community, is being given to us, when in fact the reason they can keep the tsetse fly out, Curtis, is because there's no demand for tsetse flies in this country. But there's a great demand for crack and for cocaine and for sex and for all of the different things that happen.
Crack cocaine was manufactured up until about 20 years ago. There wasn't crack cocaine.
The point I'm making is if there weren't a demand for these things, people could rise above it, even if they were planted into the communities. And we shouldn't be talking about that as the end. We should be talking about how to rise above it, whether it's a conspiracy or not.
This woman agrees with you. I'm going to let her make her point right after this. Also, there are a lot of people who believe that black men in power are the ones who are targeted most in our country. Many in the African American community feel there is a conspiracy to bring down black men before they become too powerful. Now, we're talking about people like Clarence Thomas, Ron Brown, Tupac Shakur, Marion Barry. Some of you may think of others. We'll talk about that as soon as we come back.